I believe the honourable member for Wellington, Halton Hills wishes to intervene on a previously raised question of privilege.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll try to be brief. I believe my remarks will be no more than 4 to 5 minutes. I'm rising to comment on the point of question of privilege raised by the honourable member for Perth Wellington concerning the Liberals' breach of the Parliament of Canada Act. This point of privilege concerns a real breach of members' rights. And how do we know that members' rights were breached? Well, on November 5th, 2015, Section 49 of the Parliament of Canada Act required Liberal MPs to vote 4 times. These 4 votes were to have been recorded, just like the votes are recorded here in the House of Commons. One of the recorded votes that didn't occur for that rule, was for the rule concerning caucus expulsions. On March 21st, the honourable member for Scarborough-Guildwood confirmed in an article in the Toronto Star written by Tana McCharles that with respect to the 4 votes required, quote, nothing like that ever happens in caucus, end quote. This point of privilege is timely because that confirmation that these recorded votes did not happen was reported on March 21st in the Toronto Star, only 3 parliamentary days ago. Now, Mr. Speaker, when the Prime Minister and his leadership team prevented Liberal MPs from exercising their rights under Section 49.8, he and his leadership team violated the rights of members in 3 ways, and Liberal members in particular. First, the Prime Minister deprived members of their right to vote 4 times in a recorded manner under Section 49.8. Secondly, in depriving members of their right to vote in a recorded manner for those 4 different rules, the Prime Minister deprived members of the opportunity to adopt the rule in Section 49.2 concerning caucus expulsions. In other words, the Prime Minister deprived members of their right to determine a caucus expulsion on a secret ballot vote. And 3, Mr. Speaker, in denying members their right to vote and adopt the expulsion rule in Section 49.2, the Prime Minister denied members being considered for expulsion the right to a fair process, one that is not ad hoc and arbitrary. Section 49.2 lays out a clear process for expulsion, and the bar is set very high. First, at least 20% of caucus, in this case, some 36 members of Parliament, had to write to the caucus chair requesting an expulsion vote, and second, a majority of the entire caucus, not just a majority of members present, would have to have voted in favour of expulsion on a secret ballot vote. In other words, since the Liberal caucus had 179 members, that means at least 90 Liberal members would have had to have voted for expulsion on a secret ballot vote. If only 120 members showed up, the 90 votes are still required. Now, this question is even more relevant in light of the caucus expulsions yesterday of the honourable members for Markham-Stouffville and Vancouver-Grenville. Hier soir, le Premier ministre a dit sur la télévision nationale, et je cite, « J'ai pris la décision d'expulser les honorables députés ». He added that he met with those members, quote, to inform them of my decision. These words are important for your consideration to underscore that it should not be his decision to make. MPs are not accountable to the leader. The leader is accountable to MPs. It is a vital part of the confidence convention of this House. In fact, it is so important that parts of it were taken from unwritten convention into statute law in the last Parliament. The rights of members to hold party leaders and the Prime Minister accountable are so important that the previous Parliament took some of these unwritten constitutional conventions governing party caucuses and enshrined them into the Parliament of Canada Act. Now, finally, Mr. Speaker, on December 5th, 2015, you were called to the chair as our Speaker through a vote in this House, and it also means that you were an active member of the Liberal caucus when the events in question took place on November 5th, 2015. And with the greatest of respect, there could be, at minimum, an appearance of a conflict of interest for the Speaker. But by automatically finding a prima facie case of a breach of privilege and sending this matter to the House as a whole for its consideration is one way for you as Speaker to have absolution in any potential conflict of interest. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I'll say this. Secret in-camera meetings, whether they're of committees or they're of the recognized caucuses of this House of Commons, should be no shield to prevent the upholding of the rule of law and members' rights. You are the only person, Mr. Speaker, the only person in this land who can defend these rights of members. We have no recourse to the judicial branch of the state. We have no recourse to a place outside of this House of Commons, you, sir, are our defender of our rights, and I ask that you find a prima facie case of a breach of privilege.
I thank the honourable member for Wellington, Halton Hills, although it sounded to me like he was getting kind of close to challenging the authority of the chair. It's tricky. I understand what he's saying, but order. I, of course, will endeavour to examine these questions in total fairness. The honourable member for Chilliwack wishes to add some argument.
Mr. Speaker, it's on a different question of privilege.
Member for Regina, Lewvan wanted to add something on this, the same question of privilege which was just spoken to. Is that correct? And then we'll come to the honourable member for Chilliwack.
That's correct, Mr. Speaker. I do rise to add to the very same point of privilege. The member for Wellington, Halton Hills has thoroughly explained how the Parliament of Canada Act applies to expulsions from caucus. The federal NDP leader expelled me from caucus without written notice and without a vote. So I believe that evidence should also be considered in your ruling on this point of privilege. The context for my expulsion was that another member of this House suggested that I was involved in some unspecified harassing behavior. No complaints were ever brought forward against me under the House of Commons anti-harassment policy. No complaints were ever brought forward against me through the NDP staff union. Instead, the federal NDP leader invented his own process and appointed his own investigator. So, Mr. Speaker, I think it's very important to consider the Parliament of Canada Act in this case. It does set out a clear procedure for expulsion from caucus. Whether or not that procedure applies in a given caucus is to be determined by a vote of that caucus at its first meeting after the election. No such votes were held by the NDP caucus in its first meeting after the election. In fact, no such votes were held by the NDP caucus at any of our meetings in 2015. So I believe we cannot conclude that the federal NDP leader had the unilateral authority to expel me or anyone else from caucus. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Island is rising on the same question of privilege.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'll try to be brief. I want to support fully the point brought forward by the honourable member for Wellington, Halton Hills. We will recall, those of us who were in the 41st Parliament, that the initial version of the private members' bill put forward as a Reform Act would have been far more forceful in reducing the extraordinary powers that party leaders have achieved by accretion of privileges and powers over a couple of decades that I believe are inconsistent with Westminster parliamentary privileges and our process. Mr. Speaker, as your role is to protect the rights of individual members of Parliament, I think this opportunity is before us to strengthen our understanding that leaders, as the member for Wellington Halton Hills said, members of caucuses are not accountable to their leader. The leader is accountable to members of that caucus, and the individual rights of members of Parliament in this place, not to be put upon by party leadership, needs to be fortified. This is such an opportunity, and it is simply wrong for political parties to say at the end of an election, well, that bill was passed under Conservatives, so we don't like it. The Parliament of Canada Act is the law of the land. It was passed, it should be respected, and the situation for the honourable member for Regina Lewvan, the situation for the honourable members for Markham Stouffville, from Vancouver Grenville, require us as not, and this is hard, I'd rather that this was not a partisan issue, but everything in this place is. This should be about the rights of individual members of Parliament not to have their rights put upon without due process, without following the Parliament of Canada Act, at a minimum. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.